The night is dark and echoing with vampires.
Chicago. 1918, the influenza ward smelled of camphor and rot before Carlisle ever reached the boy's bed. The particular stench of a hospital that had stopped pretending it could keep pace with the dying. Cots lined the corridor 3 deep, packed so close the nurses had to turn sideways to pass between them, and over all of it hung the low, constant percussion of coughing. Wet, ragged, endless, punctuated every few minutes by a silence that meant someone had finally stopped. Carlisle moved through it the way he moved through every human space, slow and deliberate, his white coat doing the work his unnatural stillness might otherwise have called attention to. He had been the city's quietest kind of mercy for 3 days now, choosing carefully among the dying. The ones with no family left to grieve a body that never turned up, the ones whose deaths would otherwise pass unmarked in the chaos consuming Chicago that autumn. He told himself this was the only ethical use of what he was. He had told himself a great many things across 2 centuries that he still mostly believed. The boy was 17, a chart at the foot of his cot listing a name, Edward Mason, and a temperature that had climbed past anything compatible with survival. His mother lay 3 beds down, already gone, her face covered with a sheet too thin to hide the shape of her beneath it. His father had died 2 days before that. The boy himself was barely conscious, his breath a thin, catching rattle. His skin gone the particular gray-white of a body that had stopped fighting and simply hadn't noticed yet. Carlisle had watched 100 deaths like this one in the past month. He had let nearly all of them happen exactly the way nature intended, because that was the discipline he had built his whole existence around, restraint. In all its forms, the only penance available to something like him. But there was a stillness in this boy's face even now, even dying, that caught at something Carlisle had stopped letting himself feel sentimental about decades earlier. He did not examine the feeling too closely. He simply closed the curtain around the cot, the thin fabric doing nothing at all to hide what he was about to do, and everything to signal, to anyone glancing down the corridor, that this particular patient was receiving the doctor's full and private attention. He bent low over the boy's throat. He could hear the heart beneath it, slow now, faltering, each beat arriving later than the one before, and beneath that, fainter, he caught the specific singular scent of blood already thinning with fever, already beginning, in its own slow chemical way, to die. The window shattered before his teeth had broken skin. Glass sprayed across the cot in a wide, glittering arc, and the thing that came through it landed in the narrow space between 2 beds with a weight that buckled the floorboards beneath it, vast, wrong, covered in coarse dark fur that bristled with the particular electric charge of something that had run a long way to get here, and intended to do considerably more damage before it stopped. Carlisle had time to register eyes, yellow and entirely without intelligence behind them, before the creature lunged. It was not a vampire. Carlisle understood that in the half-second it took to throw himself sideways, putting his own body between the thing and the dying boy on the cot, the scent was wrong, an animal musk layered over something feral and diseased. Nothing of the cold. Clean register vampires carried. It moved like nothing he had ever fought, low and heavy and entirely without the calculation a vampire brought even to its most savage moments. This was pure appetite given muscle and claw, careening through a hospital ward already saturated with the smell of dying humans, drawn, Carlisle understood in the same instant, by the chaos itself, a city's defenses down. Its hospitals overflowing, its streets too occupied with one catastrophe to notice another moving through them. The creature's claws caught Carlisle's shoulder and tore through his coat as though the fabric were paper, the impact driving him backward into an empty cot frame hard enough to splinter the wood. He came up fast, faster than the thing could track, and drove his fist into its skull with the full weight of 2 centuries of vampire strength behind it. The blow connected with a sound like a tree splitting, and the creature staggered, snarling, blood, its own, dark and wrong-smelling, running from a gash along its jaw. It should have ended there. Carlisle had killed vampires before, had killed things considerably faster than this lumbering, half-starved horror, and he moved now with the same total, practiced focus, closing the distance to finish it before it could recover its balance. What he had not accounted for was the boy. Edward Mason, half-conscious, fever-blind, chose that exact moment to thrash against his cot in a final, desperate spasm, the body's last argument against its own dying, and the movement, small as it was, pulled the creature's attention sideways for the fraction of a second Carlisle needed to close the kill, and didn't get. The creature's claws raked across the boy's chest and shoulder in a wide, tearing arc before Carlisle's hands closed around its throat and wrenched, the sound of vertebrae giving way loud and final in the sudden quiet that followed. The body went still. Carlisle held it a moment longer than necessary, breathing, out of habit, not need, in the wreckage of a curtained-off cot now spattered with blood that belonged to 3 different bodies at once. Edward was screaming. It was a thin, breathless sound, barely audible over the general chaos of the ward, but Carlisle's ears found it instantly, cutting through everything else. He turned, dropping the dead creature without a second glance, and knelt beside the boy's cot to find 4 parallel gashes torn deep across his collarbone and shoulder, already weeping blood at a rate his fever-thinned body could not afford to lose. There was no time left for the careful, deliberated choice Carlisle had been circling for the better part of an hour. The boy was dying twice over now, once from the influenza eating through his lungs, once from blood loss the hospital's overwhelmed staff would never reach him in time to treat. Carlisle made the decision the way he had always privately suspected he would, when it finally came down to a single, narrow window of time, not with certainty, but with the same compassion that had brought him to this cot in the first place. He bent to the boy's throat and bit down. He did not yet understand, kneeling in that ruined, curtained cot with Edward Mason's pulse fading beneath his mouth, that the venom now spreading through the boy's bloodstream would matter considerably less than the infection already seeded into the open wounds across his chest, that 2 separate curses had just entered the same dying body within the same minute, and that only one of them would ultimately take. 3 days later, Carlisle understood that something had gone wrong, though he did not yet have the language to name what. He had carried Edward out of the hospital in the chaos of that night, wrapped in a stolen coat, and brought him to the small rented room he kept on the edge of the city, a precaution, originally, against exactly this kind of complication. He had expected the venom change, the fever climbing past anything a living body could survive, the slow, total hardening of flesh into something cold, and still, 3 days of waiting for a heart to finally, permanently stop. That was not what he was watching happen. Edward's fever broke on the 2nd day. The influenza retreating with an abruptness that should have been impossible, his lungs clearing, his pulse steadying into something strong and human and entirely wrong for a body in the middle of becoming a vampire. The bite wound at his throat had healed within hours, faster than any vampire transformation Carlisle had ever witnessed, faster than anything he could explain by venom alone. By the 3rd morning, Edward Mason sat up in the narrow bed, weak, confused, unmistakably alive in every sense Carlisle understood that word to mean. Heartbeat, breath, the particular living warmth radiating off his skin that Carlisle's own senses catalogued automatically, the way they catalogued every human body within range. "Where am I?" Edward said, his voice hoarse, his eyes finding Carlisle's face with the dazed, searching look of someone trying to reassemble a string of memories that had been violently interrupted. "My mother. Where's my mother?" Carlisle had no gentle way to deliver that particular truth, and chose, in the end, simply to be honest, sitting at the edge of the bed with his hands folded, watching the boy's face crumble into a grief Carlisle recognized from 1,000 other deathbeds across 2 centuries. Except this boy was not dying. This boy, against every law Carlisle understood about his own condition, appeared to be recovering. He did not understand the wound across Edward's chest, 4 parallel scars, already closing into something pale and strange, healing at a rate that belonged to no medicine he had ever practiced. He told himself it was simply the resilience of youth, a fortunate constitution, anything that fit inside the careful architecture of what he believed the world to be capable of. He did not yet know what a full moon was going to do to that explanation. It happened 11 days later, on a night Carlisle had not thought to mark on any calendar, because he had no reason yet to understand that calendars mattered to this particular curse at all. Edward had been recovering steadily, color returning to his face, strength returning to a body that should, by every law of vampire transformation Carlisle understood, have already finished hardening into something cold and permanent days earlier. They had been talking, Carlisle asking careful, clinical questions about his condition, Edward answering with the dazed, grateful patience of a boy who believed, simply, that some miracle of medicine had spared him from the influenza that had taken everyone else he loved. He was mid-sentence when it happened. Carlisle would replay the moment for decades afterward, and never find a better way to describe it than this. Edward's voice simply stopped, mid-word, his eyes going wide and then entirely, suddenly empty. Every trace of the boy who had been speaking a half-second earlier extinguished as completely as a candle pinched out between two fingers. His body began to change before Carlisle's mind had finished processing that a change was happening at all. Bone reshaping itself with a sound like green wood splitting, fur erupting along forearms that had been smooth human skin a heartbeat before, his spine arching and lengthening with a violence that should have killed any human body outright, and simply, instead, transformed it. The thing that finished standing in the wreckage of that small rented room bore no resemblance to Edward Mason at all. It was enormous, dark-furred, its yellow eyes carrying the same flat, mindless hunger Carlisle had watched in the hospital ward 11 days earlier. The same species, he understood now, with a horror that arrived too late to be useful, as the creature that had torn through that curtain and infected the boy in the first place. Carlisle had perhaps 2 seconds to decide what came next, and he spent them doing the only thing his entire 200-year code of conduct had prepared him to do. He threw himself against the door, bracing it shut with his own body, and held it there through a night that did not end until the gray light of dawn finally, mercifully, began bleeding through the room's single window, the creature inside hurling itself against the wood again and again with a strength that should have splintered it within minutes, and somehow, through some combination of Carlisle's own vampire weight and the door's stubborn, old-world construction, simply didn't. He did not sleep. He did not loosen his grip even once. Through hours of splintering wood and animals screaming on the other side of a door that had become, in the space of a single night, the only thing standing between the world and whatever Edward Mason had just become, and somewhere in the cold, exhausted clarity of holding that door through to morning, Carlisle understood. With the same quiet, immovable certainty that had carried him to that hospital bed in the first place, that he was not going to let this boy die for what had been done to him, whatever it turned out to cost either of them in all the years, still waiting on the other side of that door. Chicago became Ashland, became a string of towns Carlisle chose increasingly for their distance from anything resembling a neighbor, and across each move the same ritual repeated itself with the practiced, grim efficiency of a family that had learned, through trial and considerable property damage, exactly what containing Edward required. The first basement, dug beneath a farmhouse outside Ashland in 1923, had been reinforced with little more than thick oak beams, and Carlisle's optimistic underestimation of what the full moon actually did to the boy's strength. It lasted 4 months before Edward tore through the support posts entirely and had to be wrestled back inside by Carlisle alone, both of them bleeding. Edward from wounds that would heal by morning, Carlisle from a gash along his forearm that took considerably longer to knit, closed than anything he'd suffered from a vampire in decades. By the second house, in 1931, the basement walls were poured concrete a foot thick. By the fourth, outside a logging town in Oregon in 1949, they were lined with riveted steel plate that Carlisle had sourced through 3 different shipping companies under 3 different names, because a man buying that quantity of armor plate in one transaction tended to attract questions he had no good answers for. Esme joined the family in 1921, drawn into Carlisle's quiet orbit the way broken. Grieving things always seemed to find their way there. And she took to the monthly ritual with a tenderness that made it somehow worse rather than better. She was the one who sat outside the basement door on the nights Carlisle couldn't, humming to herself in a low, steady register that Edward, in his rare lucid hours afterward, suspected she did less for her own comfort than for some half-formed hope that her voice might reach him, even when nothing else did. By the time Alice and Jasper found their way to the family in the 1950s, the ritual had become so practiced it had the eerie domestic rhythm of any other household chore. Reinforce the door before the full moon. Stock the basement with nothing breakable, nothing he could turn into a weapon against himself or anyone else. Wait. Listen to the walls groan under a weight none of them could fully reconcile with the slight, quiet young man who emerged from behind that door every morning after, exhausted, ashamed, and entirely painfully human again. That was the detail none of them ever stopped finding strange, decades into it. Edward bled. Edward ate. Slept. Caught colds the rest of the family had long since become immune to, and aged, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but undeniably, the smooth, unfinished face of a 17-year-old gradually, across 80 years, settling into something closer to a man in his early 20s. He noticed it before anyone said anything to him about it. He noticed it every single morning, in fact in the small shaving mirror Carlisle had given him, not because he needed to shave often, but because some part of Edward had insisted on it years earlier, a stubborn, private ritual of normalcy, in a household where normal had stopped meaning anything for everyone else around him. He had stopped, by 1987, expecting any of it to feel like anything other than a slow, quiet countdown. "You should go on ahead without me tonight," Edward said, late one evening in the kitchen of the house outside Denali, watching Esme pack a bag for a hunting trip the rest of the family had planned for that weekend, timed deliberately around a full moon that would keep Edward confined regardless. "There's no reason all of you need to stay close every single month. I'm not going anywhere. The door's reinforced. I'll be exactly where you left me when you get back." "We know that," Esme said, not looking up from the bag, her voice carrying the particular gentle firmness she'd perfected across 6 decades of exactly this conversation. "That's not why we stay close, Edward. Then why?" "Because you're family," she said simply, and zipped the bag shut, and looked at him with an expression he had never once, in all those years, managed to fully read as anything other than love he didn't believe he deserved. Families don't leave each other alone on the hardest night of the month just because the math says they could. He hadn't argued further. He never did. By that point, the arguing had worn itself out somewhere in the 1960s, replaced by a quiet, exhausted acceptance that the family's devotion to him was simply a fact of his existence, immovable as the moon's own cycle, and equally beyond his power to change. What he had never managed to make peace with, not across 69 years of practiced ritual, was the cost the devotion exacted on everyone who gave it. He thought about it most clearly in the hours just after a transformation, lying in the basement's reinforced dark with his body wrung out, and his mind slowly reassembling itself out of whatever fragments the wolf had left behind, which were never many, never enough to construct a clear account of what he'd done in there. Only impressions. Sensory and animal, claws against steel, his own throat raw from sounds that weren't words. In those hours, exhausted past the point of self-protection, the thought he returned to most often was simple and total. Every person in this family had chosen, repeatedly, across decades, to organize their entire existence around containing something that might, on any given month, finally outgrow the room built to hold it. And every one of them had chosen that for him, a boy they hadn't known a full year before the curse took hold, a stranger Carlisle had pulled out of a dying city on something closer to instinct than certainty. He understood, intellectually, that this was supposed to be love. He had simply never been able to make that fact sit easily alongside the other fact, the one that never stopped being true regardless of how many decades passed, that he was the only danger any of them would ever willingly lock inside their own house, year after year, with no end date and no cure and no guarantee that one night the door simply wouldn't hold. That was the wound underneath everything else, the quiet, unexamined conviction that had calcified into something like bedrock over the decades. Love and safety could not coexist around him. Every person who got close enough to love him was, by definition, standing closer to the thing capable of destroying them than anyone with any sense should ever choose to stand. The transformation that October night in 1991 ran longer than most, the moon hanging close to its peak for a second consecutive evening, and Edward came back to himself just before dawn, curled against the cold concrete floor of a basement that smelled, as it always did afterward, of his own sweat and something fainter and stranger underneath it that he had never found a polite way to describe. Even to himself. Carlisle was waiting on the other side of the door when it finally, mechanically, unlocked itself from the outside. A fail-safe Carlisle had insisted on installing decades earlier, a way to check on him the instant it was safe, without forcing Edward to first find the strength to call out. He came through carrying a blanket and a glass of water, the same small. Practiced kindness he'd performed hundreds of times by now, and crouched beside Edward without a word, draping the blanket over shoulders that were shaking, exhausted, entirely human again. Edward let him do it. He had stopped, years ago, having the energy to refuse the small mercies, even when some stubborn part of him still believed he didn't deserve them. Carlisle, his voice came out rough, scraped thin from a night of sounds that hadn't belonged to him. "Can I ask you something? Something I've never actually asked you directly, of course. Why didn't you just let me die?" Edward kept his eyes on the floor, on the long, pale scars scored into the steel wall across from him. Scars his own claws had carved there over decades of nights exactly like this one. in 1918. You'd already decided to turn me before that thing came through the window. You could have just let the influenza finish what it started once you understood what I was becoming instead. Nobody would have blamed you. I don't think I would have blamed you if I'd had any say in it. He finally looked up, and the question in his face was older than the words he'd used to ask it, 73 years old in every sense that mattered. Why keep doing this? Decade after decade, locking me away every month like something you're ashamed of, and then sitting outside the door anyway like you're not. Carlisle was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally answered, his voice carried none of his usual measured calm, something rawer instead, something that had clearly been sitting unexamined in him for just as long as the question had been sitting in Edward. I've asked myself that exact question more times than I can count, he said. Every single month, if I'm honest with you. There were nights in the early years when I genuinely didn't know if the door would hold, and I stood there bracing it anyway, and somewhere underneath the fear I kept thinking, if this is the night it finally fails, at least I'll have been standing here when it happened, instead of somewhere safe, having decided decades ago that you weren't worth the risk. He reached out and adjusted the blanket at Edward's shoulder, an old, automatic gesture. I don't have a good answer for you, Edward. I wish I did. I wish I could tell you I saw something in 1918 that proved, beyond doubt, that keeping you alive was the right choice, and that every night since has simply confirmed it. The truth is messier than that. The truth is, I looked at a dying boy in a hospital bed and I couldn't make myself let him die, and every single choice since then has just been me refusing to undo that first one. He met Edward's eyes, steady despite the rawness still threading through his voice. I don't have a reason that would satisfy you. I only have the fact that I would make the exact same choice again. Tonight. Tomorrow. Every month for the rest of however long either of us has left. That's not an answer. It's just the truth. Edward said nothing for a long time, sitting in the gray, post-transformation quiet of a basement that had held him, one way or another, for the better part of 7 decades, and found, in the silence, that Carlisle's answer, messy, incomplete, entirely unsatisfying by any rational measure, was somehow the only one he had ever actually wanted to hear. Forks High School, 2005. Edward smelled her before the classroom door had fully opened, and the recognition that hit him had nothing in common with the careful, clinical awareness he usually kept trained on every human body that passed within range of him. This was not the low, manageable hum of proximity he'd spent 87 years learning to live alongside. This arrived like a hand closing around something inside his chest, sudden and total, and his whole body went rigid in his seat a full 3 seconds before the new girl crossed the threshold into biology. Isabella Swan. He caught the name from Mr. Banner's brief introduction, distantly, the way a man underwater catches fragments of someone shouting from the shore. She was unremarkable in every visible sense. Pale, a little awkward, dressed for weather she clearly hadn't yet adjusted to, and none of that mattered at all against the sheer, overwhelming fact of her scent reaching him across a room full of 24 other students he'd successfully ignored for the better part of a year. He did not want to drink from her. That distinction arrived almost immediately, and its strangeness was its own kind of alarm, because Edward had spent decades around vampires whose every instinct toward an interesting-smelling human ran in exactly that single direction. What moved through him instead? Watching her settle into the one open lab seat, beside him. Because some bureaucratic cruelty in the seating chart had decided this particular humiliation was his to suffer, was something closer to a current running the opposite way entirely. Not hunger. Possession. A bone-deep, immediate certainty that nothing in this room, in this school, in this entire town was permitted to come near her again without his explicit, violent consent. The thought frightened him considerably more than hunger would have. Hunger he understood. He had built his entire existence around managing aversion of appetite, watching Carlisle model restraint for nearly 90 years, learning the shape of wanting something and choosing, deliberately, not to take it. This was not that. This had no architecture of choice built into it at all. It simply existed, total and immovable. The moment she sat down beside him and the room's temperature seemed, absurdly, to shift around her like she'd brought her own weather in with her. "Hi," she said, glancing at him with the brief, polite discomfort of someone navigating a new school's unspoken rules. "I'm Bella." "Edward," he said, and the single word cost him more careful effort than anything he'd said aloud in years. He spent the rest of the period not looking at her, which required an act of will considerably more strenuous than anything he'd had to exercise in this building before, and left the classroom the moment the bell rang with a speed that bordered on rudeness, already composing. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the argument he intended to bring to Carlisle before the day was finished. "I need to leave," he said that evening, standing in the doorway of Carlisle's study with a tension in his shoulders that made Carlisle set down the journal he'd been writing in immediately. "Not for a few days. Now, tonight, if I can manage it." "Edward," Carlisle's voice carried the careful, immediate alertness of a man recalculating every possible danger at once. "What's happened?" "Nothing's happened." "That's not." Edward stopped, frustrated by his own inability to find language for something that had no precedent anywhere in either of their experiences. "There's a girl. New. At the school. I don't know how to explain what just happened in that classroom except to say that something in me has decided, completely outside my own consent, that she belongs to me, and the wanting is not the kind I know how to fight the way I fight hunger. It isn't hunger at all. It's worse than hunger. Because hunger I can starve into submission. This feels like something that doesn't go away just because I refuse to feed it." Carlisle studied him for a long moment, and something behind his eyes, old, careful. The particular stillness of a man considering an entirely new variable in a problem he'd believed, after 87 years, he understood completely, shifted into focus. "You believe distance will help. I believe staying near her is a risk I have no right to take. You've seen what I become once a month, Carlisle. You've watched me lose every trace of myself to something that doesn't recognize anyone, doesn't spare anyone, doesn't care who's standing in the room when the moon finishes its work. If this, whatever this is, pulls me toward her the way it's already pulling, I am not willing to discover what that means on a night I have no control over at all." "Then go," Carlisle said, quiet, no argument in it, only the same exhausted, immovable compassion that had defined every decision he'd made on Edward's behalf since 1918. "Denali, stay with Tanya's family as long as you need. I won't pretend I understand exactly what you're carrying right now, but I trust you to know your own danger better than anyone else could." Edward left within the hour, and the drive north felt, for the first several hours, like exactly the relief he'd hoped for. Distance opening between himself and Forks. Between himself and a single classroom and a single unremarkable-looking girl, whose name he had no business still turning over in his mind, with the frequency he found himself turning it over. The relief did not last. By the third day in Denali, surrounded by Tanya's family and their easy, careless vampire confidence, the pull had not faded at all. If anything, it had sharpened. A low, constant ache that sat behind his ribs the way hunger sat in his throat, except this ache had no obvious cure available to it, no human body he could simply avoid feeding from until the craving passed. Distance, he discovered with a growing, helpless dread, did nothing at all to the wanting. It only made the wanting louder, the way a held breath grows louder in its own chest the longer it's refused release. "You're not eating," Tanya observed dryly, on the fourth evening, watching him sit through a family meal he had no biological need to participate in, and clearly no interest in pretending to enjoy. "Well, none of us eat, obviously, but you're doing the human thing where you stare at a plate like it's supposed to mean something to you. And it's strange to watch on someone who isn't actually human." "I'm thinking about something," Edward said. Clearly, Tanya leaned back, studying him with the particular sharpness she'd always carried. The curiosity of a woman who had spent decades collecting odd, interesting facts about the world's small handful of supernatural creatures, and found, in Edward, one of the strangest specimens she'd ever encountered. "You're the only person I know who ages, Edward. Do you know that? 90 years among us, and you're the only one whose face I can actually watch change, year over year, the way a human's does. I've always wondered what that does to a person, knowing the clock's actually running for you while it stopped for the rest of us decades ago." She tilted her head. "Is that what's eating at you? The clock?" "No." Edward turned the answer over, surprised by how true it landed even as he said it. "I've made peace with the clock, more or less. This is something else entirely. I think," he stopped, searching for words that didn't yet have a comfortable shape in his mouth. "I think I may have found something I want more than I want to be safe. And I don't know what to do with that. Because for 87 years, wanting to be safe has been the only thing that's kept anyone around me actually safe in turn." Tanya said nothing for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost its usual dry edge entirely. "That sounds less like a problem, Edward, and more like the first interesting thing that's happened to you in nearly a century." He left Denali 2 days later, the ache no quieter than it had been on arrival, and drove south through a long gray stretch of highway, turning the same exhausted argument over and over without ever once landing anywhere new. He had run because running was the only response he understood, the same instinct that had governed every choice he'd made since 1918. Distance as discipline, restraint as the only available proof of love. And the running had taught him nothing, except that some part of this particular curse did not respond to distance at all, the same way it would not, he suspected, respond to reason. Or to decades of careful self-denial, or to any of the tools he'd spent his entire unnatural life relying on. He stood at the edge of the Forks High School parking lot 3 days later, having told no one in his family he'd returned, watching Bella Swan cross from the front office toward her truck with her arms full of textbooks and her shoulders drawn up against a cold she clearly hadn't yet learned to dress for. She did not see him. He made certain of that, standing far enough back, downwind, every careful precaution he knew how to take already deployed without conscious thought. He watched her anyway. He watched the particular, unremarkable way she fumbled her keys, the small huff of frustration when her truck's engine took 2 tries to catch, and understood. Standing in the gray Forks afternoon with the ache in his chest settling, finally, into something less like pain and more like surrender, that he had lost an argument with himself he had genuinely believed. 3 days ago in Denali, he still had some chance of winning. The parking lot was slick with the thin, persistent rain that never seemed to fully commit to falling in Forks. And Tyler Carlisle's van came around the corner too fast on ice no one had bothered to salt, fishtailing wide across 2 lanes of parked cars with a shriek of rubber that turned every head within 50 feet. Bella stood directly in its path, bent over the open door of her truck. Oblivious, Edward moved before conscious thought had finished assembling the danger into words. He crossed the distance between them in something far less graceful than the careful, practiced motion he usually disciplined himself into around humans. This was raw, ugly, his shoulder slamming into the van's broadside hard enough to dent steel inward by a full foot, his boots gouging twin trenches into the wet asphalt as he planted his full weight against a few tons of skidding metal and, simply, brutally, stopped it. The van crumpled around the point of impact with a groan of tearing metal, and Edward's other arm had already closed around Bella's waist, dragging her backward and down, both of them landing hard against the side of her truck a half-second before the van's mirror would have taken her head off entirely. The parking lot went silent except for the dying creak of settling metal and the distant, delayed sound of someone screaming for help. Bella stared up at him from where he'd pinned her, half-shielded against the truck's door, and Edward watched something move behind her eyes that had nothing to do with shock at the accident itself. "You weren't anywhere near me," she said, her voice low, urgent, pitched only for him even as the parking lot began filling with running students and a chorus of disbelieving voices. "You were all the way across the lot. I saw you. And then you were just here. That's not. People don't move like that. You're in shock," Edward said, which was true and also, both of them understood immediately. Not an answer. "I know what I saw." He did not argue further, because there was no version of the conversation that ended with her believing anything except the truth, and some old tired part of him had simply run out of energy to keep building careful lies on top of each other the way he'd built them for the better part of a year already. She came to the house 3 days later, having extracted the invitation from him with a stubbornness he was already beginning to understand was simply a permanent feature of her. Not impulsiveness, but a particular immovable insistence that having seen something impossible, she had every right to be told what it meant. Carlisle met her in the front hall with the same warm, measured courtesy he extended to every guest in his house, and if there was any visible apprehension behind his eyes about what Edward intended to show her, he kept it carefully out of his voice. "He wants to take you to the basement," Carlisle said simply, after the 3 of them had stood in an uneasy silence for a moment too long. "I want you to understand, before he does, that nothing down there is going to hurt you tonight. Whatever else you decide, you're safe in this house." "Okay," Bella said, and the steadiness in that single word told Edward, with a sinking, hollow certainty, that she had already decided something he was about to spend the next 10 minutes trying very hard to talk her out of. The basement stairs were narrow, lit by a single bare bulb, and at the bottom of them stood a door unlike any door Bella had likely ever seen in a residential home, riveted steel, a foot thick by the look of the frame around it, with 3 separate locking mechanisms arranged at different heights along its surface. "This is where it happens," Edward said, his hand resting flat against the cold metal. Unable, for a moment, to make himself open it. Once a month, on the full moon. I don't choose it. I don't control it. Something takes over completely, and there's no part of the person you've been talking to for the last few weeks left inside it at all. He opened the door. The room beyond was empty except for the marks. Long, parallel gouges torn deep into steel plating that should, by any reasonable engineering standard, have been impossible to damage with bare hands. They covered nearly every surface, decades of them layered over each other in a chaotic, overlapping record of a creature trying, month after month, to tear its way out of a room built specifically to stop it. The floor itself bore the same scoring, and in one corner, a steel support beam had been bent visibly outward, a testament to some single catastrophic night that had nearly succeeded. Bella stepped past him into the room before he could stop her, and crossed to the nearest wall and pressed her palm flat against one of the deeper gouges, tracing the width of it with something that looked, to Edward's horror, less like fear than fascination. "I'm not a vampire," he said, watching her, the words coming out faster now, almost desperate, as though speed alone might finally make her understand the size of what he was telling her. "I want to be very clear about that, because I think some part of you has already guessed something supernatural and assumed it falls into a category you've at least heard stories about. This is different. I was infected in 1918, bitten, not by Carlisle, by something else entirely, a creature out of old legend that has nothing to do with what the rest of my family is. Once a month, the moon takes everything that makes me a person and replaces it with something that doesn't recognize anyone, doesn't spare anyone, doesn't care who's standing in the room when it happens. I have killed things in this room. I don't fully remember most of it afterward, and the parts I do remember, I wish I didn't." "How long does it last?" Bella asked, still tracing the gouge under her fingers, her voice steady in a way that unsettled him more than panic would have. "One night a month, sometimes longer when the moon sits close to its peak for several days running. And the rest of the time, you're just a man who ages," Edward said, "who bleeds. Who's going to die someday, the actual, ordinary kind of dying, while everyone else in this house watches it happen and can't do a single thing to stop it, the same way I can't stop what happens in this room. That's the whole truth, Bella. I'm not a beautiful, immortal thing that might accidentally hurt you, because I want your blood too badly to resist it. I'm a curse with a body attached, and once a month that curse runs completely unsupervised through whatever space it happens to find itself in. I brought you down here because I wanted you to see exactly what that means before you let yourself get any closer to me than you already have. I want you to look at this room and understand that I am asking you, as clearly as I know how. To leave while leaving is still easy." Bella turned from the wall to face him fully, and there was nothing in her expression that resembled the fear he had spent the entire walk down those stairs braced to see. "Has it ever gotten out?" she asked. "All the way out. Hurt someone outside this room?" "No," Edward said, "not yet. The room has held every single time for 87 years. Then it's holding now," she said, "and you're standing in front of me, telling me the truth instead of running from it. And that doesn't sound like a curse with no person attached to it at all. That sounds like someone who's spent 87 years making sure it never reaches anyone else, no matter what it costs him to guarantee that." She crossed the small distance between them and reached for his hand, the same hand still resting against the steel door frame, scarred faintly along the knuckles from some long-ago transformation, and held it without hesitation, without the smallest flicker of the recoil he had braced himself for. "I'm not leaving, Edward. I heard everything you just said. I looked at the walls. I'm still here. You don't understand what you're choosing," he said, and his voice had gone rough, raw in a way it rarely allowed itself to be. "This isn't a danger that fades once you know enough about it to manage it carefully. This is permanent. It will be exactly this every single month for as long as I'm alive, and I am the only person in this entire family with an expiration date. Which means eventually you'd be choosing to spend whatever years you have left tied to someone who is, by every measure that matters, already running out of time." "I'm not asking for forever," Bella said quietly. "I don't think anyone gets to ask for that, no matter who they choose. I'm asking for whatever you actually are, right now. Standing in front of me in a basement that smells like steel and old fear, telling me the worst thing about yourself instead of letting me find out some other way, some way that might have actually given me a reason to be afraid of you instead of just careful." Her hand tightened slightly around his. "That's not nothing, Edward. I don't think you understand yet how much that isn't nothing." He looked down at her hand in his, small, warm, entirely unafraid in a room built specifically to terrify anyone with the sense to be terrified by it, and felt, with a dawning horror that had nothing to do with the curse at all, that she meant exactly what she'd said, and that she was not, despite every warning he had just laid bare in front of her, going to make any part of this easy by simply walking away. The treaty line had stood unchallenged for the better part of 70 years, a quiet, unspoken boundary respected by both sides, not out of friendship, but out of the particular discipline that comes from two dangerous things agreeing, once, that war served neither of them. Carlisle crossed it now with Edward at his side, both of them moving slowly, hands visible, every gesture deliberately stripped of anything that might read as threat. Sam Yulee was waiting for them before they'd covered half the distance to the tree line, flanked by Paul and Jared in human form, all three already carrying the particular stillness of men who understood, on some bodily level, that this conversation had teeth. "You're further onto our land than the treaty allows," Sam said, his voice flat, his eyes fixed not on Carlisle but on Edward, narrowing with an intensity that had nothing to do with ordinary vampire wariness. "And you've brought something with you that smells nothing like the rest of your family." "I know," Carlisle said. "That's exactly why I'm here. I'd rather explain it to you directly than have your pack discover it on its own terms, in the dark, without warning." Sam's nostrils flared once, sharp and deliberate, and something shifted across his face. Recognition, slow and total, the particular horror of a man finding an old family story suddenly unmistakably real in front of him. "That's not a cold one." His voice had dropped into something lower, harder. "That's the other thing. The thing our legends warn about before they ever mention you people at all. His name is Edward," Carlisle said. "He's been part of my family since 1918. He was bitten as a boy, in Chicago, by a creature neither of us could identify at the time. He has no more choice in what happens to him once a month than your own people had a choice in what runs in your blood. My people choose to phase," Sam said, "every single time. We keep our minds. We keep our names. We know exactly who we are even when we're standing on 4 legs instead of 2. His gaze had not left Edward once, and the contempt in it was total, unhidden, nothing like the wary, careful distance the pack usually maintained toward vampires. "What you're describing isn't a cousin to what we are. It's the thing our legends say we exist specifically to stop. A mindless monster, dangerous to everyone within reach of it, that can't be reasoned with because there's no one left inside it to reason with at all." "That's an accurate description of what happens during the transformation," Edward said quietly, speaking for the first time, his voice carrying none of the defensiveness Sam's tone might have justified. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I don't control it. I don't remember most of what happens while it's happening. I've lived 87 years organizing my entire existence around making sure it never reaches anyone outside a room built specifically to contain it." 87 years, Sam repeated, and something in his expression hardened further. 87 years of a child of the moon living inside Quileute territory, a few miles from our children. And we're only finding out about it now because you've decided it's become inconvenient to keep hiding it. "We're finding out about it," Jacob said, speaking up for the first time, his voice carrying less of Sam's flat fury and more of something colder, more controlled, because the new girl in town has gotten herself tangled up in it. "Bella." He looked at Edward with an expression that held no warmth at all, nothing of the easy friendship that might have existed between them under different circumstances. "She's been spending time at your house. People in town have noticed. If something like that gets loose anywhere near her, it won't," Edward said. "You don't get to promise that," Sam said, his voice rising for the first time, sharp enough that Paul shifted his weight, already half leaning into the readiness to phase. "Nobody gets to promise that about something that doesn't have a mind anymore once the moon takes it. That's the entire point of what your legends are warning people about. A vampire, at least, makes choices. A vampire can be reasoned with, bargained with, held to a treaty because there's a person on the other end of it who wants something and can be made to understand consequences. What's locked in your basement once a month isn't a person making choices. It's an animal with no brakes, and you're telling me it's been sitting a few miles from our land for nearly a century. What do you want?" Carlisle asked, his voice carrying the same measured calm he'd brought to every difficult negotiation across 2 centuries. "Tell me plainly, Sam, and I'll tell you plainly whether it's something I can give you." "I want him gone," Sam said. "Out of Forks. Out of any territory close enough to this reservation that a single bad night puts my people in his path. That's not a negotiation, Dr. Cullen. That's the only acceptable outcome I can see from where I'm standing. And if I refuse, Carlisle said, because the alternative you're describing means asking a 90-year-old member of my family to simply disappear from the only home he's ever truly had, on the strength of a danger that has never once, in 87 years, actually reached anyone outside the walls built to contain it, then we have a different conversation, Sam said, and his voice had gone very quiet now, very final. One where the treaty stops mattering, because the treaty was built around an understanding that your family wouldn't bring something onto this land that threatens us the way an unleashed child of the moon threatens us. If you've already broken that understanding just by raising him here for the better part of a century, I don't know that there's a version of the treaty left worth honoring. The clearing went very still. Edward felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him, Sam's contempt, Paul's barely restrained readiness, Jacob's cold, careful calculation, and understood, with a clarity that had nothing comforting in it at all, that he had become, in the space of this single conversation, the precise embodiment of every fear these people had been raised to carry. There is a treaty that already exists between your people and vampires, Carlisle said, choosing his words with obvious care now, each one weighed before it left him. I'm asking you to consider extending its spirit, if not its letter, to cover this specific circumstance. Edward is not a vampire. The treaty's protections were never written with him in mind, which means there's no existing law either of us is breaking by having this conversation at all. I'm not asking you to trust him. I'm asking you to give us the chance to prove, through continued behavior rather than empty promise, that the containment that has held for 87 years can continue to hold. And if it doesn't, Sam said, if 1 month, the room isn't enough, then you'll have every right to do exactly what your legends tell you to do, Carlisle said. I won't stand in your way. I give you my word on that, the same way I'd give my word on anything else that mattered this much. Sam said nothing for a long moment, his eyes moving from Carlisle to Edward and back again, weighing something that had clearly cost him more than his earlier flat refusal had let on. Beside him, Jacob's expression had shifted slightly, not toward warmth, nothing so generous as that, but toward a kind of grim, reluctant calculation that suggested he was already thinking several steps past this conversation, toward whatever role Bella's presence in all of this might eventually force him to play. We'll watch, Sam said finally, every month, from the treaty line, close enough to act if we need to, far enough to stay inside the boundary we've already agreed on. If anything gets out of that basement, anything at all, even for a single minute, the agreement ends, and we come across that line without asking permission first. His eyes found Edward's, flat and unblinking. You should understand something before this conversation finishes. None of what just happened means we see you as anything other than exactly what you are. A danger we're choosing, for now, to tolerate at a careful distance. That tolerance has limits, and you won't get a warning before you find them. He turned without waiting for a response, melting back into the tree line with Paul and Jared falling into step behind him, the three of them gone within seconds, in the particular, unhurried way of predators who had decided, for the moment, that there was nothing left worth chasing. Jacob lingered a moment longer than the others, his eyes moving once more across Edward's face with an expression that held no friendship in it at all, only a cold, assessing wariness that Edward suspected, watching him go, was the most generous reaction he was likely to get from this particular corner of Forks for a very long time to come. The clearing where the Cullens played baseball sat far enough from any road that the game itself had become, over the decades, one of the family's few unguarded pleasures, speed without the careful, constant performance of restraint they maintained everywhere else. Edward stood at the edge of it that afternoon, watching Emmett send a ball arcing into the tree line with a crack of thunder, and caught the new scent a full 30 seconds before anyone else in the family registered it at all. 3 vampires, moving fast, drawn by the noise. The family reorganized around Bella with the same wordless, practiced economy they brought to anything requiring protection, and the 3 strangers emerged from the tree line a moment later with the loose, easy confidence of nomads who had never once had reason to be careful in their lives. Laurent, dark-skinned and dreadlocked, offered the kind of polite introduction vampires extended to other vampires out of habit rather than warmth. Victoria, red-haired and watchful, said almost nothing at all. James, blonde and lean, said nothing either. Not at first. Because James had stopped listening to the conversation the moment his attention crossed Edward's and caught, beneath the ordinary vampire stillness, something his hunter's instinct recognized immediately as wrong. "You're not one of them," James said, tilting his head, his voice carrying the slow, deliberate pleasure of a man discovering an unexpected gift halfway through unwrapping something else entirely. "I've spent 300 years learning exactly what a vampire smells like, in every variation this species comes in. You don't smell like that. You smell like something I tracked once, a long time ago, in Siberia, before I understood what I was actually hunting." "Edward is part of this family," Carlisle said, his voice even, careful, already calculating the shape of whatever danger James represented. "Whatever you think you're detecting, it has no bearing on why you're standing in this clearing." "Siberia," James said again, ignoring him entirely, circling now, slow and unhurried, the way a man circles something he has already decided he intends to keep. "Victoria, Laurent, you remember that hunt? The thing that tore through our camp and took down 2 trackers before we finally cornered it. We never did figure out exactly what it was. I assumed, at the time, some variant of vampire we hadn't encountered yet. I was wrong, wasn't I?" His eyes had not left Edward once, bright now with something closer to delight than threat. "A child of the moon. I've hunted 100 different things across 3 centuries, and I have never once managed to take one as a trophy, because the ones I've encountered were never anything but feral. Mindless, gone the second the moon set on them. But you're standing here, in daylight, holding a conversation. Civilized, contained," he smiled, slow and total. "That's not just a kill anymore. That's the rarest thing I've ever been offered a chance at." "You should leave," Edward said, his voice flat, every word costing him considerable effort to keep level. "Whatever you think you've found here, it isn't worth what pursuing it will cost you. Everything worth having costs something," James said. "I learned that a long time ago. The girl, though..." His attention shifted, finally, toward Bella standing half-shielded behind Emmett's broad shoulder. She's interesting too, in her own right. Human, traveling with a coven of vampires who clearly value her enough to organize an entire baseball game around keeping her safely tucked behind them. But I don't think she's the real prize here. I think she's leverage. A guarantee that whatever I decide to do next, you'll show up exactly when and where I want you to. "Leave her out of this," Edward said, and something in his voice had gone low and dangerous now, an edge none of his family had heard from him in years. "I'll consider it," James said, already turning, already drifting back toward the tree line, with the unhurried confidence of a predator who understood he had all the time in the world to finish what he'd just started. "Once I've had a proper chance to plan this the way it deserves to be planned. A trophy like you doesn't come along twice in 3 centuries, Edward. I intend to enjoy every part of taking it." He was gone before Carlisle could answer, Victoria and Laurent following a half-second behind, and the clearing fell into a silence that none of the family seemed eager to be the first to break. The days that followed carried a particular grinding dread that Edward recognized, distantly, as worse than any single confrontation could have been, the slow, accumulating awareness of being watched without ever once catching sight of the watcher. Alice's visions offered fragments, none of them complete. James circling forks at a careful distance, studying the house, studying the school. Studying, with mounting and obvious interest, the calendar tacked to the inside of Carlisle's study door. "He knows," Edward said on the 3rd night, standing at the window of his room with his hands braced against the frame, watching the gray dusk settle over the tree line. "He's not just hunting me as I am right now. He's counting days." "Counting toward what?" Esme asked, though her voice suggested she'd already guessed. "The full moon. 3 nights from now." Edward turned from the window, and the particular calm in his voice frightened the family considerably more than panic would have. "He doesn't want to fight what I am during the day, walking and talking and reasonable. He wants what's in the basement. He wants the version of me that can't recognize a threat from a friend, can't choose restraint, can't do anything except exactly what an animal does when something else dangerous is standing in the same space as it. He's going to force a confrontation timed to that night, because that's the only version of this fight he actually wants to have. Then we move you somewhere he can't reach," Carlisle said. "Somewhere further out, more secure, he'll follow," Edward said. "He's already proven he can track anything. Distance bought me nothing in Denali, when the only thing chasing me was my own instinct. It will buy us even less against a hunter who's decided I'm the rarest thing he's ever been offered a chance at." Bella, sitting curled in the armchair near the fireplace, had said nothing throughout the entire exchange, her face carrying an expression Edward recognized now as her particular brand of quiet, stubborn calculation. "He said I was leverage," she said finally. not the real prize. That means he's going to use me to get to you, one way or another, regardless of what precautions any of us take. That's exactly why you're not leaving this house until this is resolved, Edward said. That's exactly why hiding me somewhere isn't going to work, Bella said. If he's patient enough to wait 3 more nights for the moon and clever enough to have already worked out that the moon is the actual weapon he's after. You can put me anywhere in this state, Edward. And if he wants me badly enough to use as bait, he'll find a way to make it happen on his own timeline, not mine. No one in the room had a ready answer for that, and the silence that followed carried the particular helpless weight of a family that had spent 87 years building defenses against exactly one kind of danger, and now found themselves facing something that had learned, with a hunter's patient cruelty, to use that very danger as its weapon of choice. 3 nights later, far beyond the edge of the Cullen property, James stood alone at the tree line with a small, worn almanac open in one hand, tracing the printed lunar calendar with a fingertip, and smiled at what he found there, the full moon, rising that very night, precisely on schedule. Exactly as patient, and exactly as inevitable as he had been counting on it to be. The voicemail reached Edward's phone at 6:42 in the evening, Bella's voice tight with fear, giving an address to an abandoned mill on the outskirts of Forks before the line cut to static and then silence. Alice had seen nothing of it coming. The same blank wall that had swallowed her visions every time James's plans intersected with Bella's fate since the clearing. And by the time the family pieced together what had happened, the moon had already begun its slow climb toward the tree line, perhaps 2 hours from full. Edward reached the mill alone, having outrun the rest of his family by a margin that left Carlisle's voice still shouting his name somewhere behind him in the dark, because there had been no version of waiting for backup that felt survivable once he understood what James had built this night around. The building's interior was vast and hollow, old machinery rusted into stillness, moonlight already finding its way through gaps in the roof in thin, deliberate shafts. James stood at the center of it with Bella held loosely at his side, his grip not yet cruel, almost casual, the posture of a man who understood he held every advantage in the room and intended to enjoy the leisure of it. "There he is," James said, pleasant, unhurried. "I wondered if you'd come alone." "Foolish, given the math, but I suppose love makes fools of even ancient curses." "Let her go," Edward said, his voice low, every word measured against a clock he could feel, ticking somewhere behind his own ribs. The moon's pull already beginning to hum beneath his skin in a way it never did this early, never quite this strong, except tonight. With the night's actual fullness still an hour off and his body already straining toward it regardless, drawn forward, he understood distantly, by something in James's deliberate timing. In a moment, James's fingers tightened slightly at Bella's arm, and she winced, but didn't cry out, her eyes fixed on Edward with a steadiness that broke something in him even faster than fear would have. "I wanted you to see this part clearly first. I wanted you to understand exactly what's about to happen to you, in front of the one person whose opinion of you seems to matter most. That's the real trophy, Edward, not just the kill. The watching." The ache hit without warning, sudden and total, doubling Edward over where he stood, earlier than any transformation had ever come for him. The moon's pull accelerated by something he didn't have time to name before his vision blurred white at the edges and his own voice tore out of him in a sound that wasn't a word at all. "No," he managed, the single syllable costing him everything he had left of himself to produce. "Bella, run." The change took him mid-collapse, bone reshaping with a sound like green wood splitting. His shirt tearing along seams that had never been built to survive what his shoulders were becoming, fur erupting along forearms gone suddenly, violently wrong, and the last thing Edward Mason's mind registered, before the dark total absence of self swallowed every trace of him whole, was Bella's face, white with terror, not for herself. He understood somewhere in the final half-second of his own awareness, but for him. James's smile did not survive contact with what finished standing in the wreckage of his trap. The creature that had been Edward a heartbeat earlier turned on him with a speed that startled even a hunter who had spent 3 centuries cataloging every variety of supernatural violence the world had to offer. James moved to meet it, vampire fast, vampire calculating, throwing himself sideways and driving a blow into the creature's ribs that would have shattered a lesser opponent entirely, and the creature did not so much as stagger, turning instead with a snarl that filled the whole hollow building and closing one massive clawed hand around James's arm before he could pull back. The fight that followed bore no resemblance to anything either Edward or James had trained for across their respective centuries. James fought with technique, with the cold, precise calculation of a predator who had survived 300 years by never once relying on raw strength alone. Feints, redirections, strikes aimed with surgical intent at joints and tendons that, on any vampire, would have ended the engagement in seconds. None of it landed the way it should have. The creature absorbed blow after blow, with no apparent registration of pain at all, its yellow eyes carrying nothing James could read, nothing he could bargain with or outthink, simply an animal totality of violence that did not slow no matter how much damage accumulated against it. Venom meant nothing to it. James's teeth found purchase twice, sinking deep into a shoulder and then a forearm, and the creature did not flinch, did not weaken, did not show even the faintest trace of the paralysis venom inflicted on every other vampire who'd ever crossed James in 300 years of hunting. He understood, in the cold, narrowing seconds before the fight's actual end. Exactly what Carlisle's lore Bible had warned of, and what James himself had simply refused to credit until his own teeth proved it true, this prey was immune to the only weapon he had left. The end came fast, and it came total. The creature's jaw closed around James' throat with a single, decisive motion, and the sound that followed, bone and sinew giving way entirely, echoed through the hollow building louder than anything else that had happened that night. Louder even than Bella's first scream, which arrived a half-second later and didn't stop. Victoria's voice tore through the building from somewhere near the door, a single raw cry of grief and fury that the creature didn't register at all. Already turning from James's torn body toward the only other living thing left in the room, Bella stood frozen against the cold metal of an old machine press, every instinct in her screaming at her to run, and every part of her refusing to obey it, watching something with Edward's body and absolutely none of Edward's mind take a single, slow step toward her. Its yellow eyes finding her for the first time with the flat, total focus of a predator registering prey in its territory after a kill. No recognition in them at all. No trace of the boy who had stood in a basement 3 weeks earlier and begged her to leave while leaving was still easy. Nothing left in that gaze except hunger, and distance, and the simple, terrible fact of her continued presence in a room that had just finished proving, beyond any remaining doubt, exactly what it was capable of doing to anything standing inside it. Carlisle reached the mill seconds after the creature's first step toward Bella, Emmett and Jasper close behind him, all three skidding to a halt in the doorway at a sight that stopped even their considerable speed cold. Edward, transformed, blood-matted fur and yellow eyes, advancing on Bella with the slow, deliberate hunger of something that had already killed once tonight, and saw no reason yet to stop. "Bella, move." Carlisle's voice carried an authority Bella had never once heard from him before. Raw and absolute, already calculating the only outcome his 90 years of experience told him was possible. "Now, we have to." He didn't finish the sentence. Jasper had already crouched, ready to intervene, his whole body coiled toward an action none of them wanted to take, and none of them could see any way around, because the creature filling that hollow building bore no resemblance to the quiet, careful young man who had spent 87 years organizing his entire existence around making sure this exact moment never happened. And Carlisle understood, with a horror that arrived sharper than anything he'd felt since 1918, that he might have to do tonight what he had refused to do in a Chicago hospital ward nearly 9 decades earlier. "No." Bella's voice cut across the building, low but absolutely steady, and she did not move from where she stood against the old machine press. "Don't touch him." "Bella, that is not him anymore," Carlisle said, already moving, already positioning himself between her and the creature with a speed that should have ended the conversation. "Whatever is standing in front of you right now has no memory of you at all. I need you to let us. I said don't touch him." She stepped sideways, out from behind Carlisle's protective stance, putting herself back in the creature's direct line of sight, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath at once. "You've spent 90 years assuming there's nothing left in there to reach. You don't actually know that. None of you have ever tried, because none of you have ever had a reason to believe trying would work. And you do?" Jasper's voice carried none of his usual measured calm, raw with an urgency Bella had never heard from him before. "I don't know," Bella said, "but I know what happens if we're wrong the other way. If we kill him tonight because we assumed there was nothing left to save, and it turns out there was." She held perfectly still as the creature took another slow step toward her. close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating off its enormous body, smell blood and rage, and something underneath both of those that her mind, against every survival instinct screaming at her to run, insisted was still, somehow, him. I'm not running. I'm not letting any of you touch him. Just give me a minute, please. Carlisle's hand had found Emmett's arm, a silent, restraining command, and the three of them stood frozen at the edge of the room, every instinct screaming at them to intervene, held back by nothing more than the sheer, desperate conviction in Bella's voice, and the terrible understanding that interrupting her now might cost exactly the outcome she was trying to prevent. Edward, Bella's voice had dropped, low and steady, pitched directly at the creature now standing close enough to end her life in a single motion. I know you can't hear me the way you usually do. I know there's nothing in there right now that recognizes my name, or your name, or anything either of us has ever said to each other. I'm talking to you anyway, because I don't believe that's actually true, not all the way down, and I am not willing to stop believing it just because believing something else would be easier. The creature's head tilted, a small animal motion, its yellow eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that held no recognition, and also, Carlisle noticed from across the room with a dawning, disbelieving hope, none of the immediate, total violence it had shown James only minutes before. You told me, in a basement with steel walls, that you were a curse with a body attached, Bella said, not moving, not breathing faster despite every reason to. I told you that wasn't true. I meant it then and I mean it now, standing here with you looking at me like something that doesn't know my name. I think the real you is still in there. I think it's the same way the moon doesn't actually erase a person, it just buries them under something louder for a while. I'm not asking the loud thing to go away tonight. I'm just asking whatever's underneath it to remember, for 1 second, that it isn't actually alone in this room. The creature made a sound then, low and uncertain, nothing like the snarl that had torn through the building moments before, something rougher, more confused, the sound of an animal encountering a contradiction its instincts had no ready category for. Its claws, raised and ready, hovered a moment longer, and then, slowly, impossibly, began to lower. That's it, Bella said, her voice breaking now, finally, the steadiness she'd held costing her everything to maintain. That's exactly it. Stay there. Just stay right there with me. Carlisle watched, his entire body still, 90 years of certainty about the structural impossibility of what he was witnessing dissolving in real time. He had built decades of careful theory around the absolute, total nature of the curse, no memory, no recognition, nothing left of the person beneath the transformation, ever. Not once in 87 years of careful observation. He had never imagined, not seriously, not as anything beyond an idle, hopeless wish, that the theory might simply be incomplete. The creature took one more step toward Bella, and this time the motion carried none of the predatory hunger of moments before, something closer, instead to the cautious, uncertain approach of an animal drawn toward warmth it didn't fully understand it wanted. It lowered its massive head until it was nearly level with her face, and Bella, trembling now, finally, visibly, reached out one hand and rested it against the matted fur of its shoulder. I'm right here, she said. I'm not going anywhere. Whatever's left of you in there, I see it. I'm not afraid of what's covering it up. The change took him without warning. The same violent, bone-deep reversal that had claimed him an hour earlier running now in the opposite direction, fur receding. The massive frame collapsing inward, bone reshaping itself with the same sound of splitting wood, except this time ending not in something vast and feral, but in Edward, fully human again, naked and shaking and utterly spent, collapsing forward into the dirt at Bella's feet with a force that would have driven the air from a body still capable of needing it. He did not move for a long moment. Bella was on her knees beside him before Carlisle had finished crossing the room, her hands already at his shoulders, and when Edward finally lifted his head, his eyes, human again, gray-green, and entirely his own, found James's torn body across the room before they found anything else at all. Oh God. His voice came out wrecked, barely audible. Oh God, I killed him. I killed a man and I don't remember any of it. I don't remember anything except the moon. And then nothing. And then your voice somewhere far away. And I couldn't. You stopped, Bella said, her hands tightening on his shoulders, refusing to let him collapse fully into the shame already swallowing him whole. Edward, look at me. You stopped. I was standing right in front of you, completely defenseless, and you stopped. I shouldn't have been close enough to need to. He was shaking now, violent and total, the cold of the mill's concrete floor finally registering against skin that had nothing left to protect it. 87 years, Bella. 87 years of telling myself the room would always hold. That I would never have to find out what happens if it didn't. And tonight it didn't hold at all. And you were standing 3 feet away from something that had already killed once and you didn't run. No, Bella said. I didn't run. And I'm not running now, either. Carlisle knelt on Edward's other side, his hand coming to rest against the boy's back, and when Edward looked up at him. The question in his face was the same one he'd asked 70 years earlier, in a different basement, in a different decade, except this time it carried no resignation in it at all, only a raw, disbelieving confusion that demanded an answer Carlisle finally, genuinely had. I don't understand what just happened, Edward said. 90 years, Carlisle, you always said, we both always believed, there was nothing left in there. Nothing to reach. I have never once, not in any transformation across 8 decades, retained so much as a flicker of awareness. And tonight she reached you anyway, Carlisle said, and his voice carried a wonder that Edward had genuinely never heard from him before. Not in 90 years of careful, measured calm. I watched it happen, Edward. I have spent nearly a century assuming this was simply, structurally impossible, that whatever the curse takes from you, it takes completely. With no exception, ever, I was wrong. I don't know what that means yet. I don't know if it can be repeated, or trained, or relied upon the next time the moon comes. But I watched her stand in front of something I believed had no person left inside it at all, and I watched that thing choose, somehow, not to hurt her. Edward looked at Bella, kneeling beside him in the dirt of a building that smelled of blood and old machinery and the particular, acrid wrongness of a vampire's death, her hands still steady against his shoulders despite everything she had just witnessed him become and do, and felt something break open in him that had nothing to do with shame at all. The first fragile crack in a belief he had carried since 1918, the quiet, unexamined certainty that love and safety could never coexist around him, finally, impossibly, proven wrong by the one person who had simply refused to accept it as true. I'm sorry, he said, the words barely holding together. I'm so sorry you had to see any of that. Don't be sorry, Bella said, and pulled him against her despite the cold, despite the blood, despite everything the night had just shown her about exactly what she was choosing. Just stay here, just be here, with me, the way you actually are, and let the rest of it be something we figure out together instead of something you carry alone. Volterra the rumor reached Volterra the way most rumors of consequence eventually did, through a network of informants and watchers scattered across continents, fed back patiently into the throne room until something rose to the surface worth Arrow's personal attention. This particular report arrived from a nomad passing through northern Italy who had heard, secondhand, of a vampire coven in the American Pacific Northwest, sheltering something that was not quite human and not quite vampire either. Something that howled on full moons and tore through forest clearings with a strength no ordinary creature should possess. Arrow received the information with his usual theatrical delight, turning the puzzle of it over in his hands the way he turned over any rare, interesting fact about the world's stranger corners. Caius received it differently. Say that again, Caius said, his voice gone very quiet, very still, in a way that made even Marcus, usually indifferent to nearly everything happening around him, lift his eyes from whatever distant point he typically fixed them on. A child of the moon, Arrow repeated, savoring the words, watching his brother's reaction with the particular curiosity he brought to all of Caius's old well-documented wounds. Alive, contained apparently, rather than feral, sheltered, the rumor says, by a coven for the better part of a century. Carlisle's coven, if the description of golden eyes and a remote American territory is accurate, which I rather suspect it is. Caius rose from his throne so abruptly that the movement itself carried the force of a small detonation, his pale eyes gone wide and then narrow, 2,000 years of carefully buried terror surfacing all at once, with nothing left to contain it. Carlisle has been hiding one of those creatures inside his own house for 90 years. It would appear so. Do you understand what you're describing? Caius's voice had risen now, sharp and raw, stripped of every careful aristocratic restraint he usually wore like a second skin. I was nearly killed by one of those things, Arrow, 2,000 years ago. I watched it tear through 6 of our guard before we finally brought it down. And I have spent every century since making absolutely certain that species never had the numbers again to do that to anyone else. And now you're telling me a vampire I once called a colleague has been raising one, deliberately in his own home, for the better part of a century, and simply never mentioned it. I'm telling you a rumor has reached us, Arrow said, mild, watching his brother with the patient interest of a man observing a long dormant fault line finally giving way. Rumors require verification before they require action. This requires action regardless of verification. Chaos was already moving, already pacing the length of the throne room with a barely contained violence that made the guard along the walls shift uneasily. Carlisle knew the law. He knew precisely what our position on that species has been for 2,000 years, and he chose, regardless, to shelter one inside his own coven, inside a territory full of humans. A single full moon away from an exposure event that would have ended badly for our entire kind. This isn't a policy question, Arrow. This is personal. He did this knowing exactly what it would mean to me if it were ever discovered. Or he did it, Arrow said, out of the same sentimental compassion that has defined every choice Carlisle has made in 300 years, with no thought spared for you at all, because it never once occurred to him that you would ever find out. He tilted his head, considering, though I confess, brother, my own curiosity runs in a different direction than yours. A child of the moon, contained for nearly a century, retaining enough discipline to live among humans without incident, that suggests a control over the curse no specimen of that species has ever demonstrated before. I would be very interested to discover what makes this particular creature different. Whether that difference might be useful. Useful? Chaos's laugh carried no humor in it at all. You want to study it. I want it destroyed, along with every vampire who knowingly sheltered it, and I don't believe for a single moment that those two goals are reconcilable. They needn't be reconciled today, Arrow said. Send a strike force. Verify the rumor. If it proves accurate, we will decide together, as we always have, what justice requires. His eyes, however, carried none of his usual diplomatic neutrality as he said it, and Caius, 2,000 years familiar with every shade of his brother's calculation, understood perfectly well that Arrow's curiosity and his own fury were about to be sent toward Forks wearing the same uniform and serving, ultimately, two entirely different purposes. Carlisle felt the warning arrive the way he always did, through the same quiet network of contacts he'd maintained across centuries, a coded message from an old acquaintance in Florence, 3 words long, enough to tell him everything he needed to know about what was coming, and almost nothing about how much time remained before it arrived. They're coming for him, he told the family, gathered in the living room with a tension that had not fully eased since the mill. Edward sitting beside Bella with the particular stillness of a man bracing for a verdict he already suspected he wouldn't survive. Caius, specifically, Arrow's curiosity will buy us some grace in the conversation. But Caius's history with this species means there will be no version of this where he arrives interested in negotiation. How many? Jasper asked. I don't know yet. Enough that we cannot meet them alone and expect to win. Carlisle's voice carried none of his usual measured calm. I've spent 90 years building a life around protecting Edward from exactly this outcome, and I find myself, tonight, needing an ally with the standing and the numbers to make a real difference, and there is exactly one such ally within reach of us. He found Sam at the treaty line within the hour, the same clearing where the original, uneasy truce had first been negotiated, and delivered the warning as plainly as he knew how to deliver anything. The Volturi are sending a force to Forks. Soon, days, possibly less. They've learned what Edward is, and one of their leaders has a 2,000-year-old grudge against his entire species that has nothing to do with anything Edward himself has done. I'm not asking you to fight for him. I'm asking you to understand that an unchecked Volturi strike force, hunting through Forks and the surrounding territory, is a danger to your people whether or not Edward survives the encounter at all. They will not respect your land's boundaries the way my family has. They will not negotiate. They will simply take whatever they believe they're owed. Sam's expression carried none of the warmth that might have made this conversation easier, but something in it had shifted since the night of the mill. Jacob's account of what had happened there, of Bella standing unarmed in front of a transformed creature and somehow, impossibly, reaching the person still buried inside it, had clearly traveled through the pack in the days since, reshaping at least a few opinions that had once seemed entirely fixed. I'll bring it to the pack, Sam said. I'm not promising anything beyond that. It was Jacob who argued for the alliance once Sam had gathered the others, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even himself, given how little warmth he still held for Edward specifically. "I don't care about the leech," he said flatly, to a circle of pack members who knew exactly who he meant. "I care about a strike force of the most dangerous vampires alive, crossing into our territory to settle some 2,000-year-old grudge that has nothing to do with us, hunting through land that belongs to our families, with zero regard for who else gets caught in the middle of it. That's not the Cullens' problem to solve alone. That's ours too. The second they cross onto land, we're responsible for protecting. And if we help them," Paul said, "and it turns out badly anyway, we've spent decades treating that thing in their basement as exactly the threat our legends warn about. Now you want us to bleed for it. I want us to bleed for our own land," Jacob said. "Same as we always have. The fact that protecting it this time means standing next to vampires instead of hunting them doesn't change what we're actually defending." He looked around the circle, his jaw set, the same stubborn conviction Bella herself had once carried into a transformed creature's path. "I watched what happened at that mill. I heard what she did. Standing in front of something that should have killed her in a single motion. If a human girl can find enough in that thing to risk her own life for it, I think we can manage to risk something for our own territory, against an actual enemy that's actually coming for it, full moon or not." The vote, when it came, was not unanimous. But it carried, and Sam Yulee stood at the treaty line 2 evenings later, his pack arrayed behind him in human form, watching the dusk settle over a stretch of border that had never once, in living tribal memory, hosted vampires and wolves standing shoulder to shoulder against a common threat. Carlisle stood at the same line with his family arranged beside him, Edward at the center. Bella close against his side despite every argument the family had made for her safety elsewhere, and watched the horizon for the first sign of movement that would tell them Caius's strike force had finally arrived. It came at full dusk, a dozen cloaked figures emerging from the tree line with the slow, deliberate ceremony the Volturi brought to every show of force. Caius at their head, his pale eyes already fixed on Edward with a hunger that had nothing curious in it at all. Only the raw, undiluted fury of an old wound finally, after 2,000 years, finding itself a target close enough to touch. Caius stopped a dozen yards from the treaty line, his guard fanning out behind him with the slow, ceremonial precision the Volturi brought to every confrontation. And his pale eyes moved once across the assembled line in front of him, Cullens and wolves, standing together at a border that had never once, in 2,000 years of vampire history, hosted exactly this arrangement. "This is new," Caius said, his voice carrying a contempt so total it had stripped away nearly all of his usual aristocratic restraint. "Carlisle Cullen, allied with shapeshifters, standing in defense of an abomination I have spent 2 millennia hunting to extinction. I confess, I did not expect quite this particular configuration of betrayal when I crossed into this territory." "They're not shapeshifters allied with anything," Eros said mildly, stepping up beside his brother, his eyes moving over the wolves with the same bright, theatrical curiosity he brought to every new fact about the world. "I can see that much from here. Different blood entirely." "How interesting, Carlisle. You've managed to secure the cooperation of 2 separate species in a single afternoon. I begin to understand why Caius finds you so personally offensive." "They're here," Carlisle said, "because an unchecked Volturi strike force crossing into their territory threatens them every bit as much as it threatens my family, regardless of what grievance you've brought with you." "I would have thought that obvious. The only grievance that matters," Caius said, his attention narrowing back to Edward with a focus that made the air around the treaty line feel suddenly, dangerously thin, "is the one you created the moment you decided to shelter that creature instead of destroying it. I was nearly killed by one of those things 2,000 years ago. I watched it tear through 6 members of my own guard before we finally brought it down. I have spent every century since making certain that species never again had the strength in numbers to do that to anyone else. And you." His voice had risen now, sharp and raw. "You decided, on your own authority, that the law I built out of my own near death didn't apply to you, that you knew better. That compassion excused harboring exactly the threat I have given my entire existence to eradicating. He has lived 90 years among humans without a single exposure event," Carlisle said. 90 years of careful containment, of a discipline that has held every single month without exception, until a hunter deliberately engineered a confrontation designed to force the worst possible outcome. Even then, even in the one moment your entire law assumes is structurally impossible to survive, something happened that I do not believe has ever once been documented in the history of that species." He paused, choosing the next words with obvious care, aware of exactly how much weight they would have to carry. He stopped, Caius mid-transformation. With no human mind left active inside him by any account either of us understands, he stopped before harming an innocent person standing directly in front of him. I watched it happen. I did not believe it was possible until the moment it occurred. A fluke, Caius said. An accident of circumstance you're dressing up as a miracle, because the alternative is admitting what you actually did was reckless beyond forgiveness. Perhaps, Carlisle said. Or perhaps the law you built 2,000 years ago, out of a single terrible encounter with a feral, uncontained specimen of that species, was never designed to account for what might be possible under different conditions. I'm not asking you to forgive what happened to you, Caius. I am asking you to consider that your law and the reality standing in front of you tonight may simply not be describing the same thing. Caius's eyes had not left Edward, and something in his expression had begun to shift, not softening, nothing so generous as that, but sharpening into something more focused, more personal. The look of a man who had waited 2,000 years for exactly this proximity to the thing that had once nearly ended him and had no intention of leaving without using it. "Bring it to me," he said quietly, to his guard. "I want to see this control myself, before I decide whether your doctor's miracle survives close examination." "No one is bringing anyone anywhere," Edward said, stepping forward, his voice carrying a steadiness that surprised even himself, given everything 2,000 years of Caius's fury represented standing a dozen yards away. "If you want to verify what I am, I'm right here. I'm not hiding behind anyone's protection tonight, and I'm not interested in being handled like evidence in a trial that's already been decided." "You're not in a position to dictate terms," Caius said. "He isn't," Sam said, his voice carrying across the treaty line for the first time, flat and absolute. "But we are." He had not moved from his position in the line. His eyes fixed on Caius with the same rigid, immovable certainty he had once aimed at Edward himself, in a different clearing, under a different set of assumptions entirely. "This is our land you're standing on the edge of. You crossed into Quileute territory to settle a grudge that predates this country by 2,000 years, and you did it without asking permission from anyone who actually has the standing to grant it. Whatever you came here to do to him, you'll have to do it through us first." Caius's gaze swept the wolf line with new, calculating attention, and Arrow, beside him, allowed himself the smallest, most satisfied smile, the particular pleasure of a man watching a chess position resolve itself in exactly the direction his own caution had already been arguing for. 12 of us," Arrow said quietly, "for Caius's ears alone, though pitched easily within range of everyone else standing close enough to hear it. Against 7 vampires and what looks to be a dozen shapeshifters, all of them positioned to flank us the moment violence begins. I do not love those numbers, brother. I love them even less when I consider that the prize at the center of this confrontation has already demonstrated a level of control that contradicts everything we believed certain about his species, which means we have no reliable way to predict what happens if this becomes a fight at all." "I do not care about the numbers," Caius said, low and furious. "I know you don't," Arrow said. "That is precisely why I am the one doing the counting." He straightened, his voice returning to its usual public register, addressing the assembled line with the same theatrical warmth he brought to every negotiation he intended to win without bloodshed. "Carlisle, I find myself, this evening, considerably more interested in the political reality in front of me than in my brother's 2,000-year-old grievance, compelling as I'm sure it remains to him personally. You have demonstrated containment. You have secured an alliance with a species we did not even know existed in this configuration until tonight. And you have, apparently, produced evidence that contradicts established lore about a creature we believed fully understood." He spread his hands, the gesture of a man closing a negotiation rather than opening one. "I do not see a version of tonight's confrontation that ends with the Volturi gaining anything proportionate to what we would lose attempting to take it by force. Guard members are not so easily replaced that I intend to spend several of them confirming a grudge that costs us nothing to simply set aside. Arrow," Caius's voice had gone dangerously quiet, "you cannot simply walk away from this." "I can," Arrow said, "and I am going to, because that is precisely what 3,000 years of leading this family has taught me to do when the cost of satisfaction outweighs the value of collecting it." He turned to his brother, and for the first time that evening, something in his voice carried real unhidden authority rather than performance. "Your wound is real, Caius. I have never once doubted that, and I have indulged your hunt for that species more times than either of us could easily count. But I will not spend this guard's blood tonight settling a debt that predates either of us by 2 millennia, against an opponent who has just demonstrated capabilities none of our intelligence accounted for, in a position that has already been fortified by an alliance we did not anticipate. We are leaving. Caius held his ground a moment longer, his pale eyes fixed on Edward with a hatred that had clearly found no resolution at all in tonight's outcome. 2,000 years of unhealed terror left exactly as raw and exactly as hungry as it had been before he'd crossed into this clearing. "This is not finished," he said finally, the words low and promised rather than merely spoken. "I will not forget what you are, or what Carlisle chose to protect instead of destroying. There will be another night, another configuration, when the numbers favor a different outcome, and when that night comes, I will not be turned away by my brother's caution a second time." "I imagine that's true," Carlisle said quietly. "I hope, when that night comes, you'll find a reason to reconsider it anyway." Caius turned without answering, his guard falling into step behind him with the same slow, ceremonial precision they'd arrived with, and within minutes the entire strike force had melted back into the tree line, gone as completely as if they had never crossed into Forks at all, leaving behind a treaty line still holding 2 species together in a configuration that had never once, in either group's long history, existed before tonight. Sam approached Carlisle once the clearing had fully emptied, his expression carrying none of its old, rigid hostility, though nothing warm enough yet to call genuine trust either. "This doesn't make us allies," Sam said, "not in any permanent sense. We acted tonight because the threat to our own land was real, not because anything's changed about what we believe that creature represents." "I understand," Carlisle said. "I'm grateful regardless." Sam's eyes moved once to Edward, lingering there with an expression that had shifted, however slightly, since the night of the mill. Not warmth, not yet, but something closer to a grudging willingness to revise a belief that had once seemed entirely settled. "Jacob's the one who argued for tonight, not me. I'd remember that, if I were you." He turned and led his pack back toward the reservation without another word, and Jacob lingered a moment longer than the others, his gaze finding Bella's across the clearing with something that might, on a kinder night, have passed for the beginning of an actual friendship. "Take care of yourself," he said simply, and disappeared after the others into the dark. The Cullen house, hours later, had settled back into the particular quiet that followed every crisis the family had weathered together across its long history. Esme moving through the kitchen with the automatic, comforting busyness of someone needing her hands occupied. Carlisle standing at the window with a stillness that suggested he was still replaying the entire confrontation in his mind, searching it for whatever margin of safety had actually carried them through. Edward found Bella outside, standing at the edge of the property where the moon, full again, the same moon that had nearly ended everything 2 weeks earlier, hung low in silver over the tree line, exactly where they had stood once before, in the wreckage of the mill. Except now the night around them carried none of that same violence in it at all. "Caius will come back," Edward said, joining her at the rail, his voice carrying none of the old practiced despair it once would have. "Arrow bought us time tonight, not safety. That threat doesn't disappear just because it retreated once." "I know," Bella said. "I heard everything he said." She turned to look at him, and there was nothing in her expression that resembled the careful, anxious calculation he had braced himself, for years, to eventually see there. "I'm not asking for a world with no danger left in it, Edward. I don't think that world exists for anyone, vampire or human or whatever you actually are. I'm asking for this. Tonight, this moon, you standing here instead of locked away from me, both of us still finding our way through it together." He looked up at the moon hanging over them, the same light that had once stripped every trace of himself away in a hollow, abandoned building, and felt, for the first time in 87 years, that its presence did not automatically mean fear. "I used to believe," he said slowly, "that loving someone and keeping them safe were 2 things I would never get to have at the same time. Every choice I made, for nearly a century, was built around that belief. The basement, the distance, the constant careful management of how close anyone was allowed to get to whatever I actually am." He turned to face her fully. "You stood in front of the worst version of that belief, in a building that smelled like blood and old machinery, and you proved it wrong simply by refusing to leave. I don't know how to thank you for that. I'm not sure there's language built for it. You don't have to thank me," Bella said. "You just have to keep standing here. That's the whole thing, Edward. Not some grand, permanent solution to everything that could still go wrong. Just this, you, choosing to stay close instead of running, and me, choosing to stay close enough to matter. She reached for his hand, and he let her take it. The warmth of her skin against his own, steady and ordinary and entirely real, no claw marks between them tonight. No steel walls, no countdown to anything except the simple, continuing fact of two people standing together under a moon that no longer asked anything of either of them except to keep doing exactly that. Above them, the moon climbed higher, indifferent and constant, the same light that would return in another month and the month after that, for as long as Edward's slow, mortal clock continued running. Neither of them needed it to mean anything more than it already did. They stood at the rail in the quiet dark, finally, completely still, and let the night pass around them the way ordinary nights were supposed to, without violence, without fear, without anything left between them except the simple, hard-won fact of having survived this far together, and the quiet certainty that whatever came next, they would meet it standing exactly where they already were.